Hi everybody, so just in case you don't know, my name is Kate Bradbury. I'm a wildlife gardener. I've been working in as a sort of gardening journalist for about 15 years now, and specialising in wildlife gardening. I wrote a book a few years ago about the transformation of my very tiny backyard in Hove, in Brighton, from a sort of paved courtyard into a wildlife oasis, and I sort of documented all the wildlife that sort of turned up during that transformation, and then most recently sort of moved to a house with the garden that you can see here. Which also featured on Springwatch, and I've done a couple of updates on Gardeners World as well. So I've sort of spent my sort of life really transforming gardens and making them more wildlife friendly, and trying to encourage other people to do the same. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about wildlife gardening and sort of how you can make your gardens more wildlife friendly as well in sort of different ways. I could talk for hours on wildlife gardening, but I'm going to just sort of narrow it down, just sort of condense it into the 40 minutes. I'm just going to talk about basic main principles of wildlife gardening, and then focus on pollinators, because everybody seems to want to garden for pollinators, which is great news. And then caterpillar food plants, which often requires a little bit of extra sort of persuasion to get gardeners to welcome caterpillars into their homes. But I'm gonna try and persuade you and explain why they're so important, and why we should all be planting things for caterpillars. So this is my garden. This was taken this year in about sort of early July. There is a pond in there. You can't really see it at the moment because it's sort of engulfed with wildflower meadow, but it's absolutely buzzing at this time of year. It's full of sparrows. I get hedgehogs coming in. I get loads of moths, loads of bees, butterflies, and obviously, you know, it's still quite a young garden. I only planted it last year, so that the trellises are still quite bare in places, but it is maturing, and it brings me a great deal of joy. Oh, hang on. So what is wildlife gardening? Wildlife gardening is basically, there's three main principles which you should consider, and they're basically what works for you works for all life. Basically, you need to provide food, shelter and water. These are the three main things that we all need to survive. So food can be flowers if you're a pollinator, it can be leaves if you're a caterpillar or another leaf muncher. It can be seeds, obviously, for birds and mammals, berries in autumn at this time of year. And then, you know, further up the food chain, then you've got other insects and invertebrates. You've got small mammals which are eaten by other things further up the food chain, and then small birds as well. So food is a variety of different things, but it all sort of starts with the plants. Plants are at the bottom of the food chain, and everything else sort of follows. Sorry. Aha. So food for pollinators. Obviously, pollinators. There's a huge range of pollinators. There's 24 species of bumblebee alone. In the UK, there are about 270 species of bee. So one of them is the honeybee, 24 are bumblebees, and then the rest are solitary bees, which have a slightly different life cycle. If you have a bee hotel in your garden, then that will be used by solitary bees like leafcutter bees and red mason bees. There's 59 species of butterfly, most of which are resident, but some of them are migrants. There's 2,500 species of moth, about, I think it's 7,000 wasps and 9,000 beetles, or the other way around. But my point is, there's this huge array of pollinators, and each of them, they come out at different times of year, and they all have slightly different niches in the ecosystem. And that just basically means that they don't compete with each other. So they come out at different times of year, and they all have different shaped mouth parts. So bees and butterflies and moths, they suck nectar through a straw like proboscis. Proboscis is just a tongue. And it's like a straw, and they suck nectar. And you can actually see on this slide here, you can just make out this peacock butterfly's proboscis probing down into the nautia there to get nectar. So there's the sucking mouth part, and then flies have a sort of sponge-like proboscis where they sort of need to sort of rest on the flower and sort of dab away at the flower to sort of ingest pollen and nectar. And then wasps have got really big mandibles which they chew, and beetles as well, some beetles. So there's this greater range of, there's this huge array of insects, and there's this huge array of mouth parts. And so what we as gardeners need to think about when we're buying flowers in the garden centre or the nursery or online or sowing seed or whatever, we need to think about the shapes of the flowers in order to meet the needs of the greatest variety of pollinators. So as a general rule, choose open single flowers. That's flowers where you can see the centre of the bloom. So here, this red admiral butterfly is feeding on, I don't know what that is actually, possibly a helenium, and you can see the central part of the flower. It's very, very clear. Sometimes you'll get double flowers. I think I've got a slide where you know there's these double flowers have been bred to provide extra flowers, and they may look really beautiful, but you can't see the centre of the flower, and if you can't see it, then insects are unlikely to be able to get to it. Natural looking flowers, it's always worth having some weeds. I always say if you can let dandelions flower until May, like if you really hate dandelions, then just let them flower until May, because it's early in the year, lots of insects are coming out of hibernation, and dandelions do provide a really important source of nectar quite early in the year. I mean, I would argue a case for letting them flower throughout the year, because there are certain bees that have specific relationships with dandelions, but I'll leave that to your conscience. But leaving them until May is certainly really, really helpful for the early pollinators. And then something in flower from March to November, because as I said earlier, different bees come out at different times of year. And so you do get some coming out in, well, as early as January, really. Certainly in Devon, I think most of you in Devon, you can probably get away with something in flower all year round. I mean, that's what I try to do in Brighton. Just growing the perennial wallflower Bowles mauve, I mean, that pretty much flowers all year round anyway. And that just means there's just a source of nectar and or pollen in the garden for as long a season as possible. So you're providing food for the earliest pollinators that come out of hibernation, perhaps a little bit early, right through to the pollinators that haven't quite made it into hibernation, or they haven't flown back to the continent for winter. So you're just providing the greatest number of species with the greatest number of amount of nectar and pollen. So that's the general rules of flowers, growing flowers for pollinators. Keep doing this thing. There we go. So just what I was saying about double flowers there. So these are some double flowered roses. I'm sure they smell wonderful, but you can barely see the centre of the flower. And with roses, you know, the double petals do fall away as the rose ages, but there's nothing really to say that the pollen or nectar will be viable by the time the bees can reach the centre of the flower. So do just bear that in mind. If you're going to buy a rose, then just think about single flowered varieties, because they're just much better for insects. Bedding plants. Bedding plants are obviously really useful. You know, they're designed to be grown and just planted in the border, and they just flower their socks off, and you don't need to water them much, you don't need to feed them much, and they just flower and flower for months on end. And they're really useful in that respect. But with all of that breeding that's come with making them these kind of like powerhouse plants, Most of them have very little nectar and pollen in them. So they're just a bit useless for insects. So bedding plants that do work for insects include things like cosmos, which is really good. Borage makes a really good bedding plant. And there's other bits and pieces as well that you can grow that are just different to the pelargoniums and begonias that actually don't really have much going for them for insects. And then plants treated with pesticides as well. There's a lot of pesticides being used in the wider countryside and farmland, and I think as our gardens, all of our gardens put together take up more, I think around the same sort of land mass as Wales. And if every single one of us with a garden didn't use chemicals in the garden, then we could provide this wonderful safe haven for insects across the country, which is really important. Studies have shown that some pesticides, some neonicotinoid pesticides, which is a group of pesticides that are absorbed into the plants and then are present in the leaves. So when leaf munchers eat them, then it kills the leaf munchers, but also, unfortunately, it gets into the pollen and the nectar as well. So it can harm bees. And studies have shown that the bees, they can't navigate their way back to the nest properly. They are less healthy and robust, less likely to cope with downpours of rain, for example. And so, yeah, just please avoid pesticides in the garden. So it's using pesticides and buying plants that have been treated with pesticides as well. So that's a really important thing to consider when growing plants for pollinators as well. Is it going to move? Yes. So going back to shapes of butterflies, I'm just going to really spell it out for you, the different shapes. So when you're in the garden centre or the nursery or whatever, most gardeners are thinking about colour, they're thinking about height, they're thinking about how long something flowers for, which gap it's going to fill. But just in the back of your mind as well, just think about the shapes, because shapes are really important. So I've just literally clubbed together some different shaped flowers which are useful, and it's just a sort of general guide. So here is a poppy, which is bowl shaped. And if anyone, I'm sure you're all familiar with the wonderful sound of bumblebees taking a bath in poppy flowers. It's gorgeous. So they're well worth growing. Poppies don't provide nectar. They only provide pollen, but it's a really good source of pollen. Nectar is generally the same across the board. It's basically sugar water, but pollen is the protein that bees in particular feed their young with. And studies have shown that the sort of best quality pollen leads to the healthiest and most robust bees. And the best quality pollen comes in largely in plants in the legume family, so peas and beans, things like lupins, and bird's-foot trefoil and sort of things like that. That's really, really good. But poppies are also a really good source of pollen for bees. So rock roses, buttercups, and then your single roses again, they've all got that sort of bowl shape, and it just means it just provides a really nice little landing pad for bees, and they can just sort of go around and all the pollen lands on their bodies. And bumblebees and honeybees actually, because they're quite furry, when they sort of walk around a flower, when they're taking a bath in a flower, the pollen sort of falls on them, and they've got these comb-like back legs, and they just comb the pollen off their bodies and then take it back to the nest. It's lovely, and they sort of store them on these little pollen baskets on the back of their legs. So bowl-shaped flowers, and then so here we're on lipped flowers. So that looks like one flower, but it's actually a composite flower of lots of different florets, which is really important from a sort of a space point of view. So this is red clover. So one little red clover provides a lot of nectar and pollen, just because it's got lots of different sort of composite flowers. But also, if you look, each little floret is quite long, so it's quite good for long-tongued bees. So this is a common kind of bumblebee, which has got quite a long tongue, and it really likes red clover. And white clover actually is just as good, but has slightly shorter flower tubes, so is suitable for bees with shorter tongues. So as well as having different types of mouth parts, bees and butterflies and moths, they all have different lengths of tongue as well, so that determines which flowers they visit as well. So again, peas and beans have got these wonderful lipped flowers. Bird's foot trefoil. I mean, clover and bird's foot trefoil are basically lawn weeds. So one of the best things you can do for pollinators, particularly bees, is just mow your lawn less often, and these plants will just turn up. They could well already be growing in your garden. So that's a really nice thing to do if you can tolerate a little bit of scruff for 2 weeks. And then your daisy type flowers, there's literally loads of daisy type flowers. So your chamomiles and your sunflowers and your dahlias. And again, you know, you've got the central boss flower up there, which is really important. And just a note on dahlias, this is a really wonderful example of a dahlia. Pretty much anything with bishop in the title is really good for insects, and you can see on this one, you can just see all the pollen that's just sort of landed on the petals there. It's really good for bees and other insects. But do try to limit the number of double flowered dahlias you grow. This is a lovely cactus dahlia. I mean, they're great for cut flowers and things like that, but absolutely useless to bees, because again, as I was saying earlier, the bees just can't get to the centre of the flowers. It's just not accessible to them. It's like a closed shop, really. It's quite sad. So then what I call the weird daisies, which is, you know, your echinaceas and your echinops, and your knapweeds, which just provide a different shaped flower. But again, I mean, you know, your globe thistles there, which is your echinops, they're absolutely adored by bees. You know, you plant them and they're just covered in them. It's wonderful to see. And then your umbels, which I think is a fairly neglected flower shape in the garden. If you grow your own vegetables, I always let my parsnips and carrots flower, just sort of go over a little bit. If I've grown too many and I don't harvest them, rather than digging them up and putting them on the compost heap, I'll just let them flower, and that provides these really beautiful flowers. Fennel's a really good one. I always grow a bit of fennel. Hoverflies absolutely love the umbellifers. They love the fennel in particular. And obviously, if you grow fennel from a pest control point of view, most hoverflies lay eggs on aphid colonies. So if you have aphids in the garden, then grow fennel. That will bring all the hoverflies in. The hoverflies will lay eggs on the aphid colonies, and their grubs will eat all of the aphids. So I mean, I don't even have any aphids in my garden. It's so full of hoverflies, and house sparrows as well really love aphids. So that's a really good tip for getting rid of greenfly and blackfly. Angelica is really good for wasps, if you like wasps, which you should, because they're great. And then Amimagus as well, which is it's quite a nice, it's a bit like cow parsley, but it's more delicate. So those are really nice flowers to grow. And just, you know, just growing, again, as I said, just growing, you know, I hope that's sort of given you a bit of a sort of visual aid, really, as to sort of what to look for in the garden centre, as well as colours and flowering times and you know what it's going to do for you. But it's just always worth, I think, just thinking about what it's going to do for the insects as well. And then bunched flowers, so your scabious, your teasels, they just attract different types. Scabious in particular really good for butterflies. And then your long tubed flowers, so as I said earlier, some bees and butterflies have really long tongues, and you can see here on this honeysuckle, I don't know if you can see can you see my arrow? Yes. Okay, great. This can be my little pointers and stick then. So if you see here, the nectar on this honeysuckle is right down here, and the bee's tongue has got to be the whole length of that tube. So you know, you've got to have quite a long tongue to get into honeysuckle, and just for sort of scale, really, the honeybee's got a tongue length which I think is 2 millimeters long, and the garden bumblebee has a tongue length which is 2 centimetres long, so it's quite a difference in the lengths of the tongues there. Lots of moths have got quite long tongues. Certainly lots of the hawk moths will use honeysuckle flowers, which is really lovely. You just sort of go out at dusk and see what's visiting the honeysuckle. Foxgloves as well, really, really good, and penstemons, which are in flower at this time of year, which is really nice. So that's pollinators. Now, caterpillars, I think as gardeners, we've basically been conditioned to not like caterpillars and to view them as a pest and to get rid of them. Certainly working for Gardeners World magazine for sort of 15 years, you know, I've got my wildlife pages at the back where I, as much as possible, talk about caterpillars and what we should be doing for them and why we should be encouraging them into our garden. And then, like, the rest of the magazine will be how to get rid of caterpillars. You know, when I first started doing gardening articles, you know, we were encouraged to spray them with chemicals, and now we're encouraged to get rid of them organically. But we're still largely encouraged to get rid of caterpillars, and I think we need to think more about this, because caterpillars are right down at the bottom of the food chain of the garden, and that makes them very, very important. So this blue tit here, blue tits feed caterpillars to their young. Caterpillars are the perfect source of protein. They're juicy. Birds don't collect water for their young. They just feed them caterpillars, because caterpillars provide them with the water and the liquid that they need. Good source of protein, helps them grow, makes them really strong. One baby blue tit needs to eat 100 caterpillars a day for the first 3 weeks of its life. And a blue tit nest can be up to about 14 chicks. So that's 1,400 caterpillars per day for 3 weeks. So that is why birds look really knackered in spring, because they're constantly going out getting caterpillars for their young. And that's great if you live somewhere where there's lots of caterpillars. But if you live in a city or a town like me, I don't think I could provide 1 day's worth of caterpillars for one blue tit in my garden. So we all need to club together and do more for caterpillars, because ultimately that's doing more for blue tits. And certainly in urban areas, it's thought that blue tits and other birds that feed caterpillars to their young aren't doing as well as they are in other areas, because there's a shortage of caterpillars. So actually, as gardeners, we need to be looking at how we can make up for losses elsewhere by growing the right foods for caterpillars in our gardens. So it's not just birds that eat caterpillars. Most people think hedgehogs eat slugs and snails, and they do. But actually their diet largely consists of caterpillars and beetles. Small mammals will eat caterpillars, particularly in spring. You'll get field mice using caterpillars. Wasps and flies will eat caterpillars. Spiders will eat caterpillars. And amphibians like frogs and toads as well, they will all eat caterpillars. There's a huge number of species further up the food chain eat caterpillars. They're really, really important. And I just wanted to show you, caterpillars are, obviously caterpillars are the larvae of butterflies and moths, but in garden situations, it's largely moths that lay eggs, and it's moth caterpillars that the birds feed to their young. And again, some people have a bit of a sticking point with moths, because they're brown and they fly at night and they're a bit sort of suspicious. But I just wanted to show you, this is my favourite moth. This is the garden tiger moth. And this is its beautiful caterpillar, its woolly tiger caterpillar. And I've got these breeding on my allotment. In the southeast, they've declined by about 92% in the last 40 years. And it's about 70% for the rest of the country. But yeah, I think I think gardening for caterpillars and therefore moths and therefore pretty much everything else in the garden is really important, especially to species like this, which really need our help. And this one overwinters as a caterpillar, which I think is part of its demise. I think climate change is a big part of its demise, but also it overwinters as a caterpillar, and anything that overwinters as a caterpillar, it needs leaf litter, it needs log piles, it needs open compost heaps where it can just sort of settle down and hide away over winter and then come out again in spring. And obviously it also eats weeds. It eats nettles and dandelions and docks, so it needs a good supply of those as well. So, you know, if you've got a corner of the garden that you can just leave to go a bit messy, then caterpillars and moths like this will really benefit. And this is another little caterpillar, I think, as well. Caterpillars have a reputation of being really voracious eaters, of just ruining your plants and stripping them bare. And I think that's largely because of the cabbage white caterpillars, which is the caterpillars, the small and large white, but also because they're the ones that we see, they're the ones that we come into contact with. The majority of caterpillars eat very little. And you don't notice them, and because you don't notice them, you don't think about them. You only think about the ones that you do notice, and those are the ones that eat all of your plants. So just bear in mind that if you do start introducing caterpillar food plants into your garden, they're not going to have the same effect as the cabbage whites do. You'll just notice a few nibbles maybe if you go looking, but largely you probably won't notice. And this is the larvae of a comma butterfly, which is just sheltering beneath the leaf of a nettle, and it just hides beneath the leaf of the nettle and just sort of has little nibbles. I mean, you know, I only spotted it because I was looking for it. So the thing about moths and caterpillars is that they have evolved this relationship with plants since the end of the last ice age. And as such, as a general rule, only native plants are used by moths and caterpillars. So in gardens, we tend not to grow that many natives. We tend to grow non-natives, which is great for bees and other wildlife, but not so good for these egg-laying moths. There's a couple of exceptions. I can think of the mullein moth lays eggs on buddleia, and that's because the mullein moth is from China and so is buddleia. And the elephant hawk moth lays eggs on fuchsia, which is closely related to the willow herbs that it normally lays eggs on. So there are exceptions, and we can expect moths to evolve over the next few years to lay eggs on more garden plants. But at the moment, as a general rule, native plants, particularly native shrubs and trees and native wildflowers, which a lot of gardeners consider as weeds, are the best plants to grow for caterpillars. So I've just sort of put this down into sort of type of plant. So willow, birch and oak are some of the best trees for caterpillars. If you've got room for an oak, then amazing. Otherwise, I mean, just little Kilmarnock willows that you can get from the garden centre. I mean, they've still got the leaves that, you know, that caterpillars will eat. Birch, silver birch is really wonderful. Going into sort of hedging, you know, you can grow them as a native hedge, but you can also just grow them as independent shrubs, which I've got in the garden. So hazel makes a really lovely small shrub or a small tree. Field maple, which is a tree, another small tree. Spindle, they all look really, really lovely as sort of standalone plants. But obviously, as you grow them as a hedge, then you just provide a great amount of species in a smaller area. And just going back to sort of which moths lay eggs on which plants, some moths and butterflies are very specific and will lay eggs on any one or two types of plants, and some are more generalist and will lay eggs on sort of 10 types of plants. So they're all different. And so it's sort of similar to growing the greatest number of flower shapes in your garden for the greatest number of pollinators. If you grow the greatest number of caterpillar food plants, then you'll attract the greatest number of moths to lay eggs. And then, you know, they all come and lay eggs at different times of year as well. So they've all got their little niches in the ecosystem, which then provides other wildlife in your garden with a long season of caterpillars. So you're just basically just providing loads of food for loads of different species, and those that aren't eaten by those species further up the food chain will go on to breed and lay eggs the following year. So you've just got this lovely ecosystem going on in your garden of sort of life and death and rebirth. It's beautiful. Climbers are really important. I just think any bare wall or fence is a wasted space, a wasted opportunity to grow plants. So we should all grow more climbers where we can. Clematis, some clematis is better than others. If you can sort of go for something closer to the old man's beard, the clematis vitalba, then that's really good. Honeysuckle. There's our native honeysuckle, and then you can get a huge variety of honeysuckles from the garden centre, but the variety Graham Thomas is probably the closest to our native species, and it's lovely. Hops, again, this is a comma caterpillar, sort of hanging from the lower underside of the hop leaves, and hops make really lovely annual climbers as well. Well, they're perennial, but they die down every year, so they're sort of herbaceous. And then ivy, which is just one of the best plants ever. Again, it's got a bad reputation for knocking down walls and punching holes in fences, but actually studies have shown that if you plant ivy up a really strong fence or a really strong wall, then it will actually protect that wall or fence rather than knock it down. And as well as providing food for caterpillars of the holly blue butterfly and several moths, it also flowers in autumn, providing nectar and pollen for late flying insects. Then you've got your berries in spring. One Mars bar berry apparently has the same number of calories in it as a Mars bar. So, you know, they provide huge boon for birds in spring. They tend to leave the caterpillars until right at the end of the season, so that they eat them just before they get into shape for breeding, which is, I think, it's just amazing, because they know that the ivy berries are going to make them really fit and healthy. And then ivy also absorbs pollutants, so it's really good for planting in cities and reducing air pollution from traffic. And then a really recent study has shown that it can act as a natural air conditioning on our homes. If we grow ivy up our houses, then it cools our houses down in summer and it warms them up in winter without affecting humidity. And it was an RHS trial which trialled a number of different climbers, and ivy came out best. I cannot recommend ivy enough, it's amazing. So those are climbers. And then other plants, and you'll recognise a few weeds in here, but I do think it's important to grow weeds, especially just at the back of the border. You know, you don't have to see them, you don't have to put them in a pot and display them in your front garden. You know, you can just let weeds grow just behind the borders, around the shed, you know, just in little corners of the garden that you don't go or you can't see very well. And they will provide huge amounts of opportunities for lots of different species. And it's not just caterpillars, but it's, you know, it's beetles and it's pollinators and you know, all the things that sort of filter up in the food chain. So forget-me-not's really good. Foxgloves, lots of caterpillars use foxgloves. Long grass is really important. Just letting small areas of grass grow long, you'll get all sorts of species using them. Lots of about 4 or 5 different butterflies lay eggs in the grass. Loads of moths, and then obviously the grass also provides shelter for some of those caterpillars which might hibernate over winter, so they can sort of really settle down into the thatch. The grass will flower and seed, which provides food for small mammals and birds like house sparrows. And then among the grasses, you'll get wildflowers coming in as well. And the wildflowers, if they're native, will provide more caterpillar food plants for some species of moth, and then obviously nectar and pollen for insects. So long grass, if you've got space for a bit of long grass, it doesn't have to be a huge patch at all. then that's really important. And then if you can cope with a bit of dock and a bit of nettles and dandelions, then all the better. In fact, some of our most beautiful butterflies, the ones that many of us grow flowers for, you know, the red admiral, the peacock, the comma, the small tortoiseshell, they all feed on garden plants, and they're all sort of flying sort of in August, and they're really colourful and we love them. But they all lay eggs on nettles. So if you have space to have a fairly large nettle patch in a sunny spot, which I accept is probably the best part of your garden, then you should be rewarded with these beautiful butterflies laying their eggs. So I've done food, and then just very quickly, just talking about shelter really. So shelter is basically, if you look in your garden, virtually everything is shelter, but from a sort of empathetic point of view really, shelter is the home you live in, it's the umbrella you use to protect you from the rain, it's the clothes you wear to keep you warm. Shelter just enables you to thrive, to live your life really. And so lots of different things provide shelter in your garden. So I mean, I've seen a bumblebee using an allium as an umbrella before. You know, and you know, when it's quite sunny in the garden, but it's a bit cloudy, and when the sun comes out, there's always the buzz of insects, and then when it goes cloudy again, everything just sort of falls silent. And that's because the insects just dive anywhere for shelter and to protect them from the rain and protect them from the cold, because most pollinating insects are sun lovers. So this is a picture of my mum's house, and just here on the left there's this wisteria, which is providing shelter currently for sort of a pair of nesting wood pigeons. And then on the right, she's had different birds, sort of sparrows nesting in the clematis there. But I just wanted to just sort of show you just examples of shelter. And then I don't know if you can see on the right, I need to move my my bullet points onto the other side of the page. But compost heaps provide shelter, particularly the open compost heaps. So I mean, 50 years ago, compost heaps just used to be a pile of garden waste. At the end of the garden, and now we tend to put everything in plastic bins and we sort of tidy it away, so we've got this compost heap that's kind of quite tidy and sort of regimented, or we get the council to take our green waste away and the council composts it, and that's actually sort of denying huge number of species shelter and habitat. And so many species use open compost heaps. You get frogs and toads in them, you get slowworms in them, you get loads of beetles, loads of worms, woodlice, small mammals, and then large mammals. I mean, hedgehogs use compost heaps as well. Then you'll get birds picking through them too for food. Some species will nest in there, you get bumblebees nesting in there, you get hedgehogs nesting in there. Slowworms, if you're lucky, grass snakes will nest in there as well. The potential for compost heaps to provide shelter is huge, and I think we should all return to having a large open compost heap at the back of the garden rather than sort of fencing everything off and putting it in bins, and stop giving these perfectly wonderful garden material to the council to sell it back to you as compost, and you can make it yourself. If we have space, obviously. And then things like mature shrubs and trees, hedges, they all provide shelter. I think long grass is in there as well, which I've already talked about. And then artificial nest boxes. And I've put artificial nest boxes at the bottom because I think that they're sort of the least important really for most species. Because actually having the garden, having the shelter in place, having the climbers, having the shrubs and the trees, is sort of more important, having those natural habitats. And then by all means put in the bird boxes. I think tits particularly really benefit from bird boxes because they mimic natural holes in trees, so they're replacing a lost habitat. And then swift boxes and things that would ordinarily nest in our houses, they're really useful as well. But you know, things like hedgehog boxes, they're really useful, but Also, having the really large compost heap is probably more useful. They prefer their natural habitats. Oh, excuse me. Oh, just another point about shelter, really. So shelter can be anything from, you know, a large tree and a shrub, and this is just an old roof tile that I just have got at the back of one of my borders in the sunshine, which is home to some slow worms, because slow worms, they like to bask in the sun in the morning to warm themselves up because they're cold-blooded, but they like to do so hiding from other species, so they like to be sheltered. So just a dark piece of slate which warms up really nicely and just keeps them warm and safe. And slow worms absolutely love to eat slugs as well. So from a pest control point of view, they are very, very welcome. And then there's water. So a pond is the best thing probably you can put in your garden. All life needs water. We all need water. We all can't be very far away from water. And so literally every species that visits your garden will use your pond in some way, whether it's bees landing on a lily pad to drink water, or foxes popping in to drink. Hedgehogs will even go in and have a swim on a summer's evening if it's really hot. You know, and you'll get herons coming in to eat the frogs. You'll get frogs coming in to eat the flies. I mean, it's just wonderful. You dig a pond and you're just bringing life to your garden. It's the most wondrous thing. I've got 3 ponds. I've got one in my back garden, and a much smaller container pond in the front garden. If you don't have space for a large pond, then a small container pond is just well, it's not just as good, but it still provides lots of opportunities for some wildlife. And because mine's in my front garden, it's a bit of a dog bowl as well, so that's quite nice, or a fox bowl. And then and I've got one on my allotment as well, and they're all different. They're different shapes, they're different depths, and you get different wildlife coming in. But the main thing to consider when planting a pond, if you read pretty much any pond books, they'll tell you to go down to a depth of between 60 and 90 centimetres, and to have lots of shelves. Very important to have shelves for planting. But actually all of these designs are based on fish ponds, people who keep fish. But from a wildlife pond, you don't need to go down that deep. 60 centimetres is a perfect maximum depth. And then this bit here, these shallows, are the best parts of the pond, because that's where all the life is. It's where all the fun is. And this is where you'll find tadpoles. It's where you'll find all like invertebrate larvae. You'll find little caddisflies, and caddisflies are really weird. They kind of like wrap themselves in bits of leaf and stone and twig and sort of dress themselves up. And it's sort of, I think it's so that they can camouflage, but they just look really strange. Stand out like a sore thumb, I think. You dragonfly larvae as well. And then, you know, you've got all your plant material here, where things will hide from predators. And having this sort of beachy area here as well just means hedgehogs can walk in and walk out. Hedgehogs do go in for a swim, but they can quickly become tired and can drown in steep-sided ponds. So having a shallow exit is really important. This is where you'll have your birds bathing. The water is just too deep elsewhere for the birds to bathe. So this is the most important part of the pond. And so if you've only got a small space, then you can just forget this deeper area and just have a really shallow pond. You don't have to do as much digging. It doesn't have to be as big. It can be 30 centimetres deep and just sort of 2 metres wide. And it will be the perfect pond for so much life. Basically all of your invertebrate life, and some frogs and newts probably as well. Probably not deep enough for toads. They do prefer a deeper pond. But yeah, if you've not got much space or not much digging power, then just a really small little pond will be absolutely perfect. And bird baths as well, they're really important. Obviously birds need them for drinking and bathing, but actually the hedgehogs in my garden, I mean, they just use it as well. They rather visit the bird bath than go into the pond. And other species will use them as well, including bees. And if you pop a stone in the bird bath, then any bees that fall in while they're drinking will be able to sort of climb out as well. So that just stops them from coming to harm while they're in your bird bath. And that's it really. I think sort of food, shelter and water are your main considerations. They're the things that we all need to provide for wildlife, that we all need for ourselves as people. And just sort of looking at your garden with those elements in mind is just really important for wildlife, and just helps you see your garden in a different way, helps you see your garden more of a habitat than as something that's just solely sort of for you. And obviously it is for you, and we mustn't lose sight of the fact that it is for you and it is for us, but it can also be a really fantastic haven for wildlife as well. So I think, oh no, there's a toad tadpole. Anyway, so I'm Kate. This is just I've just got my books here. So I've written a book called Wildlife Gardening for Everything and Everyone, which is a practical book on how you can provide this food, shelter and water for many different species in your garden. And then you probably just can't see it, but there's the book there on the right. It's called The Bumblebee Flies Anyway, and that's the book that I described earlier, where I document the transformation of my paved garden in Hove into this sort of little wildlife oasis. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. If you just want to stop sharing your screen, that was great.
Screen.
Lovely. That was so inspiring and informative. I was making lots of notes there about all the different things to look out for. That was fantastic. So has anybody got a question that they'd like to pose to Kate, please? If you want to use the raised hand icon, or you could put something in the chat if you want. Oh, I'll go to Claire first, because I think she might have just beat Pete there. So Claire.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, yeah.
Hi. Yes, I let the grass grow at the end of my garden every year, next to my pond, because I read somewhere that the frogs like it. But we do cut the grass at the end of the summer, the beginning of autumn. Is that wrong? What should we do?
I think that's great. I think that's kind of the standard. It's the standard advice, really. If you've sort of got a meadow, is to let the grass grow long in summer. You've got loads of different species using it, and then cut it in autumn. However, I always think it's important to leave a little bit of long grass, so over winter, because you'll get things hibernating in it.
Right.
So yeah, I've got a meadow in my garden, and I cut it in early September, late August. But I always just leave a little bit, which is just, I don't know what's in there. I don't really go and investigate, but I just know that it's there.
Right. Thank you. Thanks.
Lovely. Thank you, Claire. I'll just mute you again. So Pete, I think you were next.
There we go. I'm muted.
Hi.
Kate, sorry I was a bit late on the call.
Okay.
Nice to see you. Thanks for visiting us here in Devon, North Devon.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I've been recently, earlier in the lockdown, I saw this wonderful documentary called Fantastic Fungi. And I'm just started to read a book called Mycorrhizal Planet by Michael Phillips. And there's increasing interest in the fungal realm, and particularly the mycorrhizal relationships between certain fungi and plants, and the amazing benefits to the plant realm in particular, and obviously through them to us. Just wondered if you had any insights on how we can encourage mycorrhizal fungi in our gardens, and the kind of the knock-on benefits to not just for plant health, but perhaps for other types of wildlife in the garden.
I'm not an expert on fungi, but I would say, that was a lovely question, by the way. I would say, I think dig less, hoe less, mulch more. So just basically try to recreate the natural processes. So obviously, when we're planting things, we have to dig. And when we're starting a garden, we have to dig. But once it's sort of established, then it's really good to just leave it and to just let those natural sort of fungi relationships and the mycorrhizal fungi and all of the things that we can't see beneath the surface, just sort of locking together. And then, you know, the more we mulch, you know, mulching with leaf mold every year. So I collect leaves from street trees that would otherwise be burned in Brighton, and I bag them up, and then sort of a year later I just mulch my borders with those leaves, which just mimics the natural processes of, you know, tree leaf falling and settling, and that's really good for just harbouring those sort of fungal connections as well. I think there's something to be said for growing native plants. I think that's quite good for fungal relationships, and also making sure certain trees are sort of planted close together. And again, this is something that I'm not expert on, that I've only sort of read small amounts on. But, you know, there's this sort of phenomenon called the wood wide web, which is when tree roots connect to each other and communicate and keep each other alive. It's thought that healthy trees can actually support less healthy trees by the sort of the root connectivity beneath the surface of the soil that we never ever see, and that fungi is all part of that process, and, you know, enables the plants to feed off each other, and just it's an amazing sort of realm that we don't yet know huge amounts about, but you're probably going to read loads more about it in your book, Pete. But yeah, I think those things. I think dig less, mulch more, and just think about the relationships between plants that are growing close to each other that you might not have considered.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Pete. That was a great question. Yes, I'm a great fan of no-dig gardening.
Good.
Saves lots of time and backache.
Yes, I am as well, but I've got a terrible couch gash problem on my allotment, so I keep trying to be no-dig and then failing.
Oh, cardboard's the way to go.
Yeah, layers of it.
Someone's put a question, so what's the difference between pollen and nectar?
Okay, so nectar is carbohydrate, sugar, gives you the energy to fly. Yeah, it's just sugar water, basically. And then pollen is the pollen grains, which the plants use to fertilise each other, the flowers use to fertilise each other. And pollen is your protein. So bees gather pollen and they feed it to their young. They drink nectar to give themselves the energy to fly, and then they gather the pollen to feed to their young. And it's as I said earlier, it's the bee grubs that have the best quality pollen and the most pollen that turn into the healthiest and most robust adult bees. So pollen's very important.
That's great to know the difference. Someone's put, they've got a closed compost, a plastic closed compost bin. Should they open it?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think, you know, if you've got a closed compost bin, you'll probably still get things. I mean, if it's open at the bottom, is it connected to the ground?
They didn't say, they just put it in the chat.
Okay, so, well, if it's on the ground and it's connected to the earth and you've got things that can go in, I mean, I've got closed compost bins as well as an open compost heap, and I tend to find more slow worms in the closed compost bins than the open ones, so they do have their role, but I think having an open compost heap as well as a closed one is really good. And I think food waste from the kitchen as well, I would probably keep that in the closed bin, but then have your garden waste, you know, your shrub clippings and your grass clippings and stuff like that, in a bit of an open pile at the back, and that would be really good.
Brilliant, thank you, Kate. So Peter Bedswell says he's got a problem with very large slugs, which hedgehogs and frogs don't seem to eat them, and because is it because the slugs are too large? Is there anything else that he can do? He's put his garden is fenced, so he can't attract foxes or badgers. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I've got a lot of slugs in my garden as well. I've just given up growing things that they like to eat. I know that's a bit of a cop-out, but just grow spiky things. Grow lots of holly. They don't eat holly. Sorry, Peter.
Right. I had a question. So. Another question about slugs and snails and eating vegetables. Someone's said they tried grit, sheep wool, copper, and still seem to eat everything. So I think what you're saying, you know, sometimes we might have to put up with the slugs and just try and grow alternative things.
Yeah, I mean, the only sort of natural remedy that's really worked for me has been bramble stems. So if you've got brambles growing, I've got loads of brambles going on my allotment. I just make these little twigs, sticks, and it's really painful to do this. It's a very painful, slow process. But you make these little walls around your seedlings with these bramble stems, and the slugs don't bother going over it because they don't like to climb over the prickly stems. But from a vegetable point of view as well, I've just got to a point where I just grow 3 times as much as I need to and hope that it doesn't get eaten. And also just using cloches. I think planting things out when they're a bit older, so certainly for courgettes and squashes, just plant them out just before it's too late. And it just gives them a fighting chance, really, because if you plant them out too soon, they'll just get eaten overnight, and it's heartbreaking. So just wait until the plants are a little bit older before planting them out. Make little spiky walls with brambles, and be vigilant. I think, you know, if you go out every night and you pick them off, I mean, I don't really want to advocate killing them. I mean, I've taken slugs and snails on holiday before to the park, but I've since spoken to a park ranger who was really upset that I did that. So I don't know. Yeah, it's a tricky one. It is a tricky one. I think just grow more than you need and just take lots of deep breaths when it doesn't work out, really.
Yeah, I think you just have to accept some sacrificial plants, don't you, when you're planting out.
Yeah, and make habitats for slow worms, because slow worms absolutely love slugs, although the smaller ones, they by the time they get really big, they don't eat them.
Great, thank you, Kate. And then there's a good question here. Someone's got fences all the way around their garden. Should they make an underpass and holes to let the frogs and toads and hedgehogs in?
Yes, 100% on either side, please. Thank you. And speak to neighbours and get them to do the same as well.
Great. It's a question for Pete here, actually. Pete, can you put in the chat the name of the book that you mentioned earlier?
Oh.
Someone's asking about that.
All done already. It's in there.
Lovely, well done.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got lots more questions. I'll keep going. So someone's about to buy a house with an orchard, and they're not looking forward to the wasps on the fruit trees.
Oh.
So is there anything that any of the good insects?
Okay, well, wasps are good insects. You will only notice wasps. I mean, it's worth saying there's about 9,000 species of wasp in the UK. And the only ones that bother us that we know about are the social wasps, the common wasp and the German wasp largely. There's a few other social species. And we only really notice them in August and September when they start to get annoying. And the reason they get annoying is because the queen wasp, the life cycle of a wasp is quite similar to that of a bumblebee. The queen wasp establishes the nest in April. She'll lay eggs and go out and get food to feed those grubs that they hatch into. And while bees are vegetarian and they feed pollen to their young, wasps are carnivorous and they feed caterpillars, aphids, thrips, all of these things that gardeners consider to be pests, they feed to their young. So wasps are hugely important in the garden. If only they ate slugs. They're hugely important in the garden for most of the year. And what happens is that the queen lays those first few eggs, they hatch into grubs, she feeds the grubs, then they turn into worker wasps, and then they go out and get the food and bring it back for the next batch of grubs that the queen has laid. So you've got this growing cycle, this growing nest. And what the wasps do, the wasp grubs, is they secrete a sugary substance as a reward for the workers to bring them their food. So the workers go out and they get caterpillars and grubs and other things to bring back to the grubs. And the grubs then secrete this sugary solution which the worker wasps drink. So they get rewarded for bringing this food back. And nests are annual. So around sort of August, September, the queen stops laying eggs. So those worker wasps that have spent the last 3 months going and getting food and bringing it back to the nest in exchange for this sugary solution, they no longer have that role. They no longer get their sugary solution. So then they go and attack fruit, which I think is fair enough, really. And that's where they get their sweet fix from. And then sometimes in very hot summers, that fruit has fermented and the wasps get a bit drunk, and that's when they start to really behave badly. And it's just not their fault. And I think we just need to be a bit nicer to them and just and reward them for all the hard work that they've done the rest of the year, and let them have a few plums.
Yeah, the wasps get a bad press, don't they?
They do.
So there's another fruit tree related question actually. Someone says they're looking to replace an apple tree. Is there a particular variety that you'd recommend for wildlife?
All apples are good for wildlife, but I think what a really nice thing is to do wherever you live in the UK is to have a bit of a Google and find out which old apple trees are local to your area. And so I did that when I planted my first garden in Hove. I planted it with two local apple trees because Brighton used to be, well, Sussex used to be, you know, have lots of orchards in it. So I've got two old Sussex varieties planted in my garden, which is really nice. So I'd go for a nice ancient bit of history to plant in your garden. You'll find some nice varieties.
That's a good idea. Debbie's got a good question actually, cause, same as me. Are woodlice good? I have loads.
They're really good at breaking down wood. They're fantastic. They're in part of a group of invertebrates called detritivores, which just help break down garden waste. So if you've got a bit of rotting wood, you know, the woodlice will be there eating it. They do eat vegetables and fruit, and apparently they don't have the mouth parts to do it. Apparently it's other things that make the holes in the fruit, and then the woodlice take advantage of this. I don't believe this. I think woodlice can be quite little voracious things when they want to. I don't mind, I just cut out the holes that they make, but I've just harvested a pumpkin and had to wash all of my woodlice out of it before I took it home. So yes, they're good, but they can be a bit annoying. Is my honest answer.
Yeah. So this is a good question actually, because it's something that my neighbour's always worried about encouraging rats into the garden. So obviously we want to encourage the wildlife, but preferably not the rats. Yeah.
I mean, I think in 25 years of gardening, I've had 2 rats. I put cameras out every night to watch the hedgehogs, and I've never seen a rat. If I did, I'd stop feeding the birds for a couple of weeks and I'd keep an eye on it, and I'd probably rearrange my compost heap. Rats don't like change. I do get them on the allotment sometimes, usually in winter. In fact, the only 2 times I've had rats has been in winter, and I'm pretty sure it's always been 1 or 2 individuals looking for somewhere to just somewhere warm and cozy in winter, and they found a nice compost bin, and if I hadn't noticed and picked it up, then come spring they would have brought back their friends, and suddenly I would have had a big family of rats on my hands. But because I noticed, that didn't happen, because I mean I didn't kill them, but I did make them homeless, and I know that's really mean, but I live in an urban area, I've got neighbours. You have to, you know, if I lived in the country I'd probably be a bit more relaxed about it, but my experience of rats is that it's actually quite easy to get rid of them, or to just encourage them to move on. So I don't think that's something we need to worry about, because it's quite easy to sort out in the early stages.
That's reassuring to hear then. So someone's put, I have bees larvae in my bee house. Should I transfer them to the garage for winter, or just leave them outside in the bee house?
Definitely move them into the garage for winter if it's cool, but not if it gets really warm. So you need to be outside temperatures, but just it needs to be dry. It needs to be cool and dry. But yes, when you must remember to put them back out again in spring.
Lovely, thank you, Kate, so much. We'll leave it there for this evening. So what a great evening it's been. So just to let you know, we've got an event another online event in a couple of weeks' time, which is going to be with Adam Reeve, who's done some events for us already, and he's from the Ramblers Pantry, and he's going to be talking about what's good to forage in autumn. So that will be great. I must say a big thank you as well to our funders, the North Devon AOMB and the North Devon Biosphere, for helping with our project at the Countryside Centre. And thank you all for coming tonight and supporting our event. And finally, a massive big thank you to Kate for a brilliant evening. So if you could all join me in a virtual hand clap or thumbs up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it. It's been lovely to see you.
It's been brilliant. Thank you. Lovely. Bye, everybody. Have a nice evening.
Bye. Take care.
Bye. Bye-bye.